Hello and welcome, friends. In today's session, we have to basically discuss why the services sector has shown such a phenomenal growth in the last few decades. You would recall that in the first lecture that we had, we basically talked about the definition of service, and then we talked about the different types of service industries. And in the last session, we talked about the global trends in services sector. We talked about how service sector has been showing phenomenal growth in terms of its contribution to the Indian GDP, and we also saw that in terms of employment also there has been a slight increase in number of people who are employed by the services sector, or proportion of our total jobs that are generated in India. There has been a slight increase in the contribution of service sector in that as well. Now we need to understand today what is the reason behind the phenomenal growth of the services sector, right? So let us understand these reasons. The first reason which is there is increase in income levels. Now how does increase in income levels lead to an increase in demand for services and overall growth in the services sector? Please understand, when people tend to start earning more, they also tend to start spending more on health and education, right? For example, if somebody is very poor, he's not likely to send his children to a very good school, right? On the other hand, once if somebody starts earning a little bit of money, then they start devoting this extra amount of income to health and education. They procure the best nutrition for their children. They start consuming protein rich diet. They start sending their children to good schools. So this happens when the income levels increase. Again, when the income levels increase, people also tend to travel more. People go and visit different places, and they also tend to spend on entertainment services more. They go to cinema halls, they go to sports stadiums to watch sports, they go to malls and spend money there, they eat out, they dine out. So this happens when there is an increase in income levels. So naturally, when there's an increase in income levels, people tend to spend more on health and education services and travel and entertainment services. So there is a growth in demand, there is an increase in demand for these services, and this is one reason for increase in demand for services in as a whole and growth of the services sector. Now let's have a look at the second significant reason behind growth of service sector: urbanization. Now what do we mean by urbanization? Let us first of all understand what we mean by urbanization. Urbanization basically means, this is basically the proportion of your population which lives in urban areas. I'll give you an example of India. Up till around 2010, India's urbanization levels were just 20%, which meant only 20% of the people are living in urban areas like towns and cities and metros. The 80% of the people still resided in the rural areas. Now this is slowly shifting, and you see that by the end of 2025 it is expected that the urbanization levels in India would be around 30%. That is, 30% of the people in India would be living in cities and towns, and by 2050 this is going to rise to 50%, which means half of the population would be living in towns and cities, while the remaining half would be living in rural areas. So this is what we mean by urbanization, and you understand that slowly and slowly the level of an urbanization has been increasing. I gave you this picture of what is happening with the Indian economy. 20% urbanization level in 2010, by 2025 it would be 30%, and by 2050 it is expected to be around 50%. So what happens when people start migrating from rural areas to urban areas? There would be more requirement of transportation services in urban areas. Again, security services, for example, would be required. Guards would be required to take care of the commercial establishment or an office or the place of residence. So there would be requirement of guards and security services. There would be more requirement of transportation. Then there would naturally be more and more banking and insurance services. Why? Because they would be required by people who are now staying in urban areas, because these people would probably buy different types of items and they would require probably credit or loan for that, so they would go for banking, or they might want to insure themselves against the risk of death or maybe health risks, so they will go for insurance, and the demand for these services would also increase. Again, there would be a lot of demand for retailing. I hope you understand what we mean by retailing. Retailing, the perchun walas, that is what we mean by retailing. But here retailing term has been used to denote the organized retail. For example, the chains like Subiksha or Big Bazaar, so that is known as organized retail. So there is an increase in demand for such services. Why? Because in urban areas people simply do not have that much time, so they cannot spend a lot of time buying items. So what will they do? They will go to a retail store which stocks different types of items and they'll buy from there. So requirement of these type of services also increases as the level of urbanization increases, right? Then we also understand that when there is an increase in level of urbanization, people tend to eat out more. There would be more restaurants which will be required to cater to these people who have now settled in the urban areas. Then there would be demand for housekeeping and laundry services also. Laundry, I hope you understand, washing of clothes, and housekeeping is basically cleaning the house. So that is what housekeeping basically is. And naturally, when more people stay in cities and urban areas, they require more of these kind of services, and that is why many of the people who are staying in such areas, metros like Delhi, they also employ housemaids to do these kind of jobs. So naturally there would be an increase in these kind of services, and there would be also an increase in marketers who are providing these kind of services, which would lead to increase in the growth rate of the services sector. Now let us look at another very important reason: women in the workforce. What do we mean by this? Women in the workforce basically means how many women are entering the workforce. If you have a look at the generation of your grandparents, you would find that generally women used to stay at home and used to take care of the household duties, while the men used to work outside in offices, right? But now women are also entering the workforce. In your case, probably you would, after completing your graduation or PG, you would want to join workforce and you would want to work with some organization. So more and more women are entering the workforce. Now what would be the impact of that? Since more women would be entering workforce, they would have less time left for household duties, right? What kind of household duties? For example, cooking, cleaning the household, doing the laundry, clothes washing, and that is why they would start employing, they would start employing more number of maids, right? So there would be an increase in demand for these kind of services. Then babysitting and day care. What do we mean by this? Please understand. What happens is when women start working and then they get married and they start having children, they simply do not have the time to stay at home to look after their children. So they would require these kind of services wherein somebody else would be taking care of their children in their place. So these kind of services are known as babysitting services. And what do we mean by daycare? Daycares are basically creches. So wherein you can keep your toddler, keep your child while you are at work from 9 to 5. You can simply keep your child in a daycare home or in a crèche wherein he will be taken care of by the people there in that daycare home. So this is what we mean by daycare services. So demand for these kind of services would increase, and this would lead to growth in services sector. Now have a look at another very important reason why there is an increase in demand for services. Increase in life expectancy. People are dying at a later age. If you would recall, and if you look at the statistics, in 1930 the average life expectancy was very low, much below 50 years, which means on an average an individual used to stay alive till the age of 45 or 50, but now if you look at the life expectancy in India, it's somewhere around 67, 68 years, which means an average individual dies somewhere around 67 to 68 years of age. Now what happens when life expectancy increase? First thing is, people tend to grow old, because now you're not dying at the age of 50, you're dying at the age of, let's say, 80 or 85 or 90. Just now, if you would recall that Mr. Dilip Kumar died, he died at the age of 98. So naturally there would be requirement of geriatric care services. Geriatric care means tending to people who are aged, senior citizens, above 70, above 80. So that is what we know as geriatric care services. So there would be a lot of requirement for these kind of services, right? And there would be so many marketers who would be providing these kind of services. For example, nowadays you can employ a full-time nurse for somebody who is very old in your house. You are not able to spend time on him to take care of him because you have to go out for your job or for some other reason. So what you can do is you can employ a full-time nurse. So that would be an example of a geriatric care service. Again, financial planning would also be required. Now why would you require financial planning? See, generally people retire at the age of 60, 65 years, right? But earlier the life expectancy was just 50 or 55 years, but now the life expectancy is, let's say, 67, 70 years, which means after retiring at least you would be still alive for 10 or 15 or 20 years, which mean that you would not be having any regular source of income because you have retired, but you still want to have something so that you can survive after the retirement and before you die. So what do? You go for financial planning. And so there are so many financial planning services which are available. There are sites like policybazaar.com who help you in comparing the different types of financial planning products and then purchase a particular product which you find more suitable. So this is why there would be an increase in demand for financial planning services when there is an increase in life expectancy, and this would lead to increase in the growth rate of service sector. Again, role of government is also very, very important. Please understand, another reason for why there is an increase in the service sector, increase in the growth rate of service sector and increase in contribution of service sector to the overall GDP is that government has to provide these services: law and order, maintenance of law and order, and then defense services. Then they also provide social services like health and education. Now for all these, the government, when provides all these things, government is basically providing you some service. And please also understand, as there is an increase in the population in India, if you look at the population figure, India's population is almost around 130-135 crores. So there is an increase in population, right? And more increase in population would lead to more requirement, more demand for these kind of services. You would require more police personnel to take care of law and order. You would require more army to take care of the defense. You would require more hospitals, healthcare services. You would require more primary health centers in the villages or community health centers in blocks. You would require more schools, government schools, and more government colleges and government universities. So there would be naturally an expansion of these kind of services, which would lead to increase in the growth rate of service sector. Now let's also look at one very, very important aspect why there is been an increase in the growth rate of service sector, and this very important point is industrialization. Now what do we mean by industrialization? I'm sorry for this. Industrialization basically means more and more industries coming up. And what do we mean by this? Basically, we mean to say that there are more and more firms which are coming up. For example, you have been to Ashoka Leyland Rudapur plant, right? So they came to Uttarakhand after the formation of Uttarakhand in 2000 because they were induced into investing in Uttarakhand because they were being offered various incentives, right? So they started setting up their factories in Uttarakhand, right? But please understand, Ashoka Leyland does not manufacture tires. So it gets supplies of tires from some other companies and then uses it to assemble its vehicles, buses and trucks, and then ships out these assembled buses and trucks to various markets, various customers across the country. Now how do they get this supply of tires, and how do they ship out the assembled buses or trucks? So they definitely need somebody to transport these tires, or to somebody to transport these assembled buses and cars. So these kind of service providers are known as logistics service provider, right? Merck, for example, MERCK is an example of such a logistics service provider. So there would be more demand for this kind of services when there are more industries which are coming up in a particular area. Again, there would be more demand for advertising services, right? You would require more of advertising services, because naturally many of the companies, they do not have their own in-house advertising department, so they need some advertising agencies to design the promotional campaign for them. And I hope you would recall our discussion in advertising and sales management, wherein we talked about various advertising agencies, right? For example, Mudra is one, Lintas is another. We have talked about these advertising agencies. So their services would be required when there are more companies who are selling their product in the market. So naturally these companies would require more and more promotional campaigns, more and more advertising campaigns, and there would be demand for advertising services, right? Again, there are so many companies which come up, they require their manpower to be trained, and many a times they do not have an in-house department within the company to train manpower, and this is specifically happening with smaller companies. And what will they do then? They will again look for some third-party service provider who will train their manpower. Fine. So there are such manpower training service providers also who offer their services to these kind of industries, right? And then many a times when more industries come up, they need more credit, they need more loans, and naturally there would be an increase in demand for the banking services, and again for legal services also. The reason being that when there are more companies, there are likely to be more disputes, and whenever there are disputes, you need to solve them, and for that you need somebody to advise you how to go about solving a particular dispute, right? Or how to lodge a court case against some other company, right? So for that you need legal services. So there would be more requirement for legal services and banking services. Likewise, there would be more requirement for accounting services. For example, if you look at many small shopkeepers, in the last 2-3 years after the launch of GST, goods and services tax, these small businessmen, they are not equipped with the knowledge to handle the computer. They do not know how to file their GST returns. So there is a lot of demand of those people who can file their GST return on their behalf. So this has happened because more businesses have come up and they need to file their GST returns, and naturally when they need to file their GST returns, if they cannot do it on their own, they would need somebody else to provide them these kind of services. And that is why we have this concept of GST Mitra. GST Mitra आजकल आ गए हैं. They help these companies in filing GST returns. So there is more demand for these kind of services. Why? Because so many industries, so many businesses have come up. So more the number of businesses in a particular economy, more the requirement for these services, be it logistics, advertising, manpower training, banking, legal services, and accounting services. And there are so many other services which would be required, and naturally there would be more demand for these services, and this would again lead to growth in service sector. So thank you very much for your time today. This is the discussion that we have had today. In tomorrow's session, we'll be talking about classification of services. Thank you very much for your